At her own funeral, Christina suddenly sat up and flew to the church rafters, screaming that she could not breathe because of the stench of your sins. To escape the smell of humanity, she threw herself into boiling water, stood in frozen rivers, and crawled into red-hot ovens while her skin charred before the eyes of the terrified crowd. Was she a living miracle or a vessel for 1,000 demons? Discover the story of a woman whose holiness was more terrifying than any curse. In the 12th century, the town of Sint-Truiden was a place where the rhythms of life were dictated by the ringing of cathedral bells and the changing of the seasons. Among the simple folk lived 3 sisters, orphaned and devoted to a life of quiet labor and prayer. The youngest, Christina, was known for a peculiar intensity in her faith, a girl whose eyes seemed to trace patterns in the air that no one else could perceive. She moved through the muddy streets with a lightness that bordered on the ethereal, her presence often unnoticed until she spoke in whispers of things far beyond the comprehension of her neighbors. One afternoon, without warning or prior ailment, the young woman collapsed in the middle of a sunlit field, her body striking the earth with a finality that silenced the birds in the nearby thicket. Her sisters found her there, cold and unresponsive, her skin already taking on the waxen hue of a spirit that had departed its vessel. There was no breath to mist a mirror, no pulse to stir the throat, only a profound and terrifying stillness that suggested the end of her earthly journey had arrived far too soon. The local physician, a man of few words and many superstitions, confirmed that life had indeed fled from her lungs and heart. For several days and nights, the body of Christina lay in the humble cottage, a sight of mourning for the few who had known her gentle nature. The air in the small room remained unnaturally chilled, despite the midsummer heat that pressed against the shuttered windows. Neighbors came to pay their respects, crossing themselves as they looked upon the girl who had always seemed more shadow than flesh. There was a sense of profound loss, yet also a strange anticipation, as if the very walls of the house were holding their breath, waiting for a resolution that the rites of the church were soon to provide in the hallowed ground of the cemetery. When the time came for the final farewell, the pallbearers lifted the simple wooden casket and carried it through the winding alleys toward the great stone church. The sound of their boots on the cobblestones echoed like a rhythmic heartbeat, a stark contrast to the silence within the box they carried. The priest awaited them at the heavy oak doors, his face etched with the solemnity of his office as he prepared to guide this soul into the afterlife. The incense smoke swirled in the damp morning air, creating a gray veil that seemed to separate the world of the living from the cold, impending embrace of the tomb that waited. Inside the sanctuary, the atmosphere was heavy with the scent of melted beeswax and ancient dust, a place where generations had sought solace from the hardships of the medieval world. The casket was placed upon the bier in the center of the nave, surrounded by flickering candles that cast long, dancing shadows against the icons of the saints. The congregation gathered in the pews, their faces pale in the dim light, their voices joined in a low, somber chant that filled the cavernous space. It was a scene of perfect, traditional mourning, a community united in the ritual of letting go of one who had never truly belonged to their earth. The priest began the Requiem Mass, his Latin phrases rolling over the heads of the faithful like waves against a rocky shore. He spoke of the fragility of life and the mercy of the Creator, calling upon the angels to receive the spirit of the departed girl. Every eye was fixed on the altar, and the silence that followed the prayers was thick and expectant. It was at this precise moment, as the sun broke through the stained glass and splashed colors across the wooden lid of the coffin, that the first sound was heard, a sharp, metallic snap that echoed through the vaulted ceiling like a heavy blow from a blacksmith hammer. A collective gasp escaped the throats of the mourners as the lid of the casket did not merely shift, but buckled under a force from within. The wood groaned and splintered, revealing the pale fingers of a hand that should have been locked in the rigidity of death. Those closest to the bier recoiled in terror, some tripping over benches in their haste to escape what they believed was a restless spirit or a trick of the devil. The priest froze, his prayer book trembling in his grip, as the entire structure of the coffin began to shake with an intensity that defied all natural laws of the physical world, signaling a return that was never meant to be. Then, with a suddenness that paralyzed every soul in attendance, Christina sat upright in her shroud, her eyes snapping open to reveal pupils that seemed to burn with an inner, celestial fire. There was no transition from death to life, no gasping for air or slow awakening, but a violent surge of vitality that seemed to crackle through the very air. She looked neither at her sisters nor at the priest, but gazed upward with a fixed and terrible intensity. Her face, previously softened by the repose of the grave, was now twisted into a mask of absolute, unadulterated shock, as if she were seeing things hidden from the eyes of mortal men. Before any man could reach out to touch her or utter a word of command, the girl emitted a high-pitched, guttural cry that vibrated in the bones of everyone present. Her body did not rise as a human climbs, but ascended with the grace of a bird caught in an updraft, defying the pull of the earth. She soared toward the high, shadowed reaches of the church, her shroud fluttering behind her like the wings of a moth. The congregation watched in a state of religious ecstasy and primal fear as she reached the massive timber beams of the roof and perched there, her hands gripping the wood with a strength that was entirely inhuman. From her vantage point high above the altar, Christina looked down upon the sea of upturned faces with an expression of profound and visceral disgust. She began to speak, her voice echoing with a clarity that reached the furthest corners of the stone walls, but her words were not of peace or blessing. She screamed that she could no longer endure the presence of the living, for the atmosphere of the church was thick with a stench that no one else could perceive. It was the smell of human sin, a rotting, cloying odor that she claimed was rising from the souls of those gathered below like a black, suffocating mist. She described this odor as more foul than the most decomposed carcass, a spiritual miasma that choked her throat and burned her nostrils. The people below, many of whom had lived lives of quiet desperation and hidden vice, felt a sudden, piercing shame as her gaze seemed to peel back their very skin. She clung to the rafters, refusing to descend into the cloud of corruption she saw swirling around the pews. The holy incense, which usually brought comfort to the faithful, now seemed to her like a mockery, unable to mask the true nature of the depravity that she insisted was inherent in every beating heart present in the room. Panic began to ripple through the congregation as some fell to their knees in frantic prayer, while others fled into the bright daylight, unable to bear the scrutiny of the girl on the ceiling. The sisters of Christina wept openly, their joy at her return eclipsed by the terrifying transformation of her character and her bizarre, elevated state. The priest, regaining his composure, began to chant exorcisms, his voice cracking as he commanded whatever spirit had taken hold of the girl to depart. But she only laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone, and climbed even higher into the darkness of the rafters. This was the moment when the town of St. Truiden was changed forever, the instant when the boundaries between the sacred and the profane were irrevocably blurred. Christina, the girl who had been dead, was now a creature that existed between worlds, a judge perched in the shadows of the house of God. Her return was not a miracle of comfort, but a harbinger of a life that would be defined by impossible suffering and terrifying clarity. As she stared down from the heights, her eyes reflected the flickering candle flames, making them look like twin beacons of a light that did not belong to the sun or any lamp crafted by human hands. The authorities of the church and the leaders of the town stood in the nave, looking up at the small, dark figure that refused to rejoin the world of men. They realized that they were not witnessing a simple recovery, but the birth of a phenomenon that would challenge every doctrine they held dear. Christina's body remained taut and ready, a coiled spring of energy that seemed fueled by a source far removed from bread and water. The mystery of her journey during those days of silence began to weigh heavily on their minds, for if she had truly seen the realms beyond, the knowledge she carried back was enough to incinerate the foundations of their lives. As the hours passed and the sun began to dip below the horizon, the church fell into a heavy, apprehensive twilight, yet Christina did not move from her high perch. She remained there, a silent sentinel against the darkness, her presence a constant reminder of the unseen rot she claimed to detect in everyone. The townspeople whispered in the streets, wondering if they should offer sacrifices or bring chains to bind her. But deep in their hearts, they felt a growing, icy fear that the girl they had tried to bury was now more alive than any of them, and that her return was merely the beginning of a long, agonizing trial. The priest, clutching his silver crucifix with whitened knuckles, began to speak in a voice that commanded the very foundations of the sanctuary. He did not ask, but ordered Christina by the authority of the Holy See to descend from the rafters and explain the nature of her return to the world of the living. For a long moment, the only sound was the whistling of the wind through the high stones, but then, with a slow and deliberate movement, the girl loosened her grip on the timber. She drifted downward, her feet barely touching the marble floor as she came to rest in the center of the nave, a safe distance from the crowd she claimed was so foul. Once she stood among them, her presence was even more unsettling than her flight, for she seemed to vibrate with a frequency that did not belong to the earth. Her skin was pale as alabaster, yet there was a warmth radiating from her that pushed back the chill of the stone walls. As the congregation held its collective breath, Christina began to speak of her journey into the darkness that followed her collapse in the field. She described the sensation of leaving her body as a release from a heavy, rusted suit of armor, her spirit soaring into a void that was neither light nor shadow but a threshold between realities. The first place she visited, according to her harrowing testimony, was a realm of eternal fire and unquenchable thirst that stretched beyond the horizon. She saw the rivers of liquid sulfur where the souls of the unrepentant were tossed like dry leaves in a storm, their screams forming a cacophony that replaced the very concept of silence. Christina watched as the shadows of those she had once known in the town were dragged into the depths by unseen, heavy weights of their own making. The heat was so intense that it seemed to burn the very memory of ice and rain from her mind, leaving only the searing awareness of divine justice. From the depths of the abyss, she was led to a vast, shimmering plain that was colored in shades of ash and iron, where a different kind of suffering awaited the weary. This was the gray expanse of purgatory, a place where the air was thick with the sighs of those who were not yet lost but not yet found. She saw people she recognized, their faces etched with a longing so sharp it could cut through stone, as they waited for the prayers of the living to lift them toward the light. These souls were surrounded by a cleansing flame that did not consume the flesh but peeled away the layers of earthly pride and hidden selfishness. Finally, she felt herself pulled upward through a tunnel of blinding radiance until she stood before the crystalline gates of the celestial kingdom. The beauty of that place was so overwhelming that she found herself unable to breathe, for the very air was made of music and the scent of flowers that had never known decay. She saw the light of 1,000 suns reflected in the eyes of the gathered host, and for a brief, eternal moment, she believed she had reached her final home. The peace she felt was a weightless joy, a sense of belonging that made her former life in the mud of the village seem like a distant and insignificant dream. It was then that a voice, which felt like the vibration of the entire universe, spoke to her spirit without the need for sound or language. The Creator offered her a choice that would define the rest of her existence and the destiny of many others who were still trapped in the cycle of sin. She could enter the gates and remain in the bliss of paradise forever, leaving the world of men to its own devices and its inevitable end. Or, she could return to the cold, heavy vessel of her body and endure the most excruciating tortures a human could survive to serve as a living sacrifice for the souls she had seen in the fire. Without hesitation, driven by a compassion that burned hotter than the flames of hell, Christina chose to return to the world of the living. She accepted the burden of the flesh not as a gift, but as a tool for the redemption of the wicked and the relief of the suffering spirits she had left behind in the gray plains. As she finished her tale, the church was silent, for no one dared to breathe in the presence of a woman who had seen the face of God and turned back to the earth. Her sisters wept, but Christina looked at them with a detached sorrow, knowing that her life was no longer her own. From that day forward, the nature of her existence changed into a performance of agony that defied every law of nature known to the scholars of the 12th century. She sought out the very elements that would destroy a normal human being, using her body as a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. Her first act of penance took place in the village bakery, where the scent of fresh bread usually brought comfort to the hungry. Christina walked toward the massive brick ovens while the fires were at their peak, her eyes fixed on the glowing embers that danced behind the iron doors like malevolent spirits. To the horror of the bakers, she crawled into the belly of the furnace and curled her body among the white-hot coals as if she were settling into a bed of soft down. They watched through the openings as her clothing began to smoke and the smell of singed hair filled the room, yet she did not cry out or attempt to escape. She remained in the heart of the fire for a time that seemed impossible, her skin turning the color of charred wood while she whispered prayers for those in the depths of hell. When she finally emerged, her body was a blackened ruin, a sight so gruesome that many of the onlookers turned away in sickness. However, as they watched, a transformation occurred that left the witnesses trembling with a fear that bordered on insanity. The charred layers of skin began to flake away like the husk of a seed, revealing new, pink flesh beneath that was as smooth and unblemished as a newborn child's. Within minutes, every trace of the fire had vanished, leaving Christina standing in the center of the room without a single scar or blister to mark her ordeal. This cycle of destruction and rebirth became the rhythm of her life, a constant reminder that her body was merely a temporary house for a spirit that could not be broken. When the winter winds began to howl across the lowlands, bringing a frost that turned the river moss into a sheet of jagged glass, Christina found a new way to test the limits of her endurance. She would walk to the banks of the freezing water and wade into the current until the river reached her chin, remaining there for hours while the ice formed a collar around her neck. Her skin would turn a deep, bruised blue, and her limbs would become as stiff as the frozen branches of the willow trees. She watched the flow of the water with a calm intensity, her mind far away in the realms of the spirit. The townspeople would gather on the shore, wrapped in heavy woolen furs, watching the small, shivering figure in the water with a mixture of pity and revulsion. They expected each moment to be her last, waiting for the current to sweep her under the ice or for her heart to stop in the grip of the cold. Yet, when she finally chose to step out of the river, she would walk across the frozen ground with bare feet, her body steaming in the winter air as if she were a hot coal being pulled from a hearth. Her health never faltered, and no fever ever touched her brow, despite the impossible conditions she endured. Perhaps her most terrifying displays occurred deep in the ancient forests, where the heavy wooden wheels of the watermills churned the streams with a relentless, mechanical violence. Christina would climb onto the spinning structures and allow herself to be dragged beneath the surface, her body caught between the massive timber blades and the moss-covered stones of the riverbed. The sound of her bones snapping under the pressure was often heard by the millers, who would run to the edge of the water in a desperate attempt to rescue what they assumed was a mangled corpse being ground to dust. They would watch the churning froth for signs of her remains, expecting to see only blood and splintered bone emerge from the machinery of the mill. But time after time, the water would deposit her gently onto the muddy bank, her limbs twisted in ways that should have been fatal to any creature of flesh and blood. As she lay there, the onlookers would see her eyes roll back in her head, and within the space of a dozen heartbeats, her body would snap back into its proper alignment. She would stand up, brush the water from her face, and offer a quiet prayer of thanks before disappearing back into the shadows of the trees. The news of these miracles spread like a wildfire across the countryside, drawing pilgrims and skeptics alike to the small town of St. Truiden to witness the woman who could not die. They brought the sick and the dying to her, hoping that some of her supernatural resilience might rub off on them, but Christina often fled from their touch. She remained a creature of isolation, her senses still attuned to the invisible stench of sin that she claimed radiated from every human being she encountered. To her, the physical pain of the fire and the ice was a mercy compared to the spiritual agony of being near the living. Even the most learned men of the church were at a loss to explain how her tissues could regenerate so quickly or why her mind did not shatter under the weight of such constant trauma. Some argued that she was a living saint, a vessel of the Holy Spirit sent to remind a fallen world of the reality of the afterlife and the price of redemption. Others whispered in the dark corners of taverns that she was a witch who had made a pact with the Prince of Darkness, using illusions to trick the eyes of the faithful while her soul remained firmly in the grip of the adversary. Christina herself cared nothing for the opinions of men or the labels they tried to pin upon her unconventional holiness. She lived on a diet of tree bark and ditch water, her physical needs reduced to the absolute minimum required to keep her spirit tethered to the earth. Her every waking moment was a labor of intercession, a constant struggle to balance the scales of divine justice through her own voluntary suffering. She became a living ghost, a person who moved through the world but was no longer of it, her eyes always looking past the horizon toward the gates she had once stood before. As the years passed, the frequency and intensity of her penances only grew, as if she were trying to compress an eternity of purgatory into the short span of a single human life. She would jump from high cliffs into the rocky ravines, only to walk away without a scratch, or stand in the middle of a swarm of angry wasps, allowing them to sting her until her face was unrecognizable. Each time, the result was the same, a period of horrific disfigurement followed by a miraculous and total restoration that left her more radiant than she had been before the ordeal began. The emotional impact on the community was profound, for they could no longer ignore the reality of the spiritual world when it was being carved into the flesh of one of their own. They began to see their own small sins and daily cruelties through the lens of Christina's suffering, realizing that if such a pure soul required such agony for redemption, their own prospects were grim indeed. The town became a place of somber reflection, where the laughter of the taverns was often silenced by the sight of the young woman standing in the middle of a bonfire in the town square. In this second stage of her journey, Christina became a mirror that reflected the hidden darkness of the human heart back upon itself. She was no longer just a girl who had returned from the grave, but a living monument to the terrifying beauty of absolute devotion. Her life was a paradox that the medieval mind struggled to categorize, a blend of divine madness and supernatural grace that seemed to defy the very mercy of the God she claimed to serve. She was a sign and a wonder, a woman who had conquered the fear of death by embracing the most horrific aspects of life. The initial atmosphere of divine wonder that had gripped the town of St. Truiden began to sour into a pervasive and heavy sense of dread. The citizens, once eager to witness a miracle, now found themselves living in the shadow of a woman who seemed to reject the very essence of human society. Christina no longer walked among them as a neighbor or a friend, but as an alien presence that haunted the periphery of their daily lives. Her silence was a judgment, and her erratic movements suggested a mind that was untethered from the constraints of the physical world, creating a tension that could be felt in every dark alleyway and crowded marketplace. Driven by an agonizing sensitivity to the presence of others, Christina began to seek out the most inaccessible places she could find. She was seen scaling the vertical walls of the abbey with the grace of a mountain goat, her fingers finding invisible holds in the ancient masonry. She sought the highest points of the architecture, perching on the edge of stone gargoyles and narrow parapets where the air was thin and cold. From these heights, she looked down upon the town with an expression of profound sorrow, her eyes tracing the movements of the people below as if they were nothing more than ants crawling through a pile of refuse. When the stone heights did not provide enough distance from the perceived stench of human sin, she retreated into the deep, ancient forests that surrounded the settlement. There, she chose to live in the crowns of the tallest elms and oaks, swaying dangerously in the wind on branches that seemed far too thin to support her weight. She would remain perched in these leafy towers for days at a time, indifferent to the driving rain or the scorching sun. To those who watched from below, she looked like a tattered, pale bird that had forgotten how to fly, a creature that had abandoned the earth but was not yet permitted to enter the sky. On the darkest nights, when the wind howled through the trees, Christina would descend from her arboreal heights to seek a different kind of isolation in the local graveyards. She would crawl into the narrow gaps of stone tombs or press her body against the cold surfaces of sarcophagi, seeking the scentless silence of the long dead. In the company of the ancestors, she found a peace that the living could never offer, as if the stillness of the crypts was the only environment that matched the quietude of her own resurrected soul. Her affinity for the dead only increased the town's growing suspicion that she was a creature of darkness. The children of the town, fueled by the nervous energy of their parents, began to treat Christina as a target for their cruelty. They would gather at the edge of the woods or at the base of the church walls, their small hands filled with jagged stones and hardened clods of earth. With shrill cries, they would take aim at the fragile figure silhouetted against the gray clouds, laughing as their projectiles whistled through the air. Christina never flinched or attempted to defend herself, even when the stones struck her flesh. She remained motionless, accepting their violence with a terrifying passivity that only served to frustrate and embolden her youthful tormentors. As the months passed, the whispers in the taverns and the corridors of power took on a more sinister and theological weight. The men of the town argued that no true saint would hide like a wild beast or display such blatant contempt for the human form. They began to suggest that the entity inhabiting Christina's body was not her own spirit, but a legion of ancient and cunning demons. These spirits, they believed, were masters of mimicry who had returned from the grave specifically to mock the sacred mysteries of the church. The idea that a devil could wear the skin of a martyr became a primary source of terror for the simple folk of St. The fear eventually reached a breaking point, and the local authorities decided that Christina had to be restrained for the sake of public order and her own safety. A group of strong men was sent into the woods with heavy nets and ropes, stalking her through the underbrush as if they were hunting a dangerous predator. When they finally cornered her at the base of a massive linden tree, the struggle was brief but intense. Despite her frail appearance, she possessed a wiry, unnatural strength that required several men to overcome. They pinned her to the damp earth, her eyes wide and staring, while they bound her wrists and ankles with thick hempen cords. To ensure she would not escape again, they summoned the town's blacksmith to the gates of the local dungeon. He arrived with his anvil and hammers, his face grim as he prepared to forge iron restraints specifically for the girl who could fly. The sound of the hammer striking the red-hot metal echoed through the stone corridors, a rhythmic and brutal song of imprisonment. Heavy iron chains were wrapped around her waist and limbs, and the rivets were hammered shut while she lay on the cold straw of the cell. She was treated not as a woman, but as a supernatural threat that had to be anchored to the ground by the sheer weight of industrial iron. The dungeon was a place of absolute darkness and damp rot, where the only sound was the dripping of water from the ceiling and the scurrying of rats in the corners. Christina was left there alone, her body pressed against the wet stone, the iron links of her chains biting into her skin. The jailers expected her to weep or beg for mercy, but she remained perfectly silent, her breath coming in slow, even cycles. There was a sense in the room that the walls were not holding her in, but rather that she was allowing herself to be there, her mind wandering through landscapes that the guards could never hope to imagine in their waking lives. On the first morning of her captivity, the guard who went to bring her bread and water found the heavy oak door standing wide open, though the iron bolt remained firmly in the locked position. He rushed into the cell, his heart pounding against his ribs, only to find the room completely empty. The iron chains that had been riveted to her limbs lay in a heap in the center of the straw, intact and unbroken, as if the body they had held had simply turned to smoke and drifted through the metal rings. There was no sign of a struggle, and no indication of how she had passed through the solid stone and the heavy, locked door without a sound. The news of her escape sent the town into a state of near hysterical panic, and a second, larger hunting party was organized immediately. They found her within hours, standing on the very edge of a high cliff that overlooked the river, her hair streaming in the wind. This time, the capture was even more violent, and the restraints they applied were twice as heavy as the first. They used specialized locks and reinforced iron bars, and the priest was called to sprinkle the cell with holy water and chant prayers of containment. The people were determined to keep the mystery of Christina under their control, no matter the cost to her physical form. However, the laws of men continued to fail in the presence of her inexplicable power. At the stroke of midnight, the guards heard a sound like the rushing of a great wind through the underground tunnels, followed by the distinct, metallic chime of locks being turned by invisible hands. When they reached her cell, they found the doors swinging on their hinges and the air filled with the scent of wild lilies and ozone. Christina was gone once more, leaving behind only the cold iron and the silent stone. The frustration of the authorities grew into a bitter resentment, as they realized their physical world had no tools capable of binding her spirit. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, the townspeople were awakened by a sound that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. They looked toward the great linden tree in the center of the square and saw Christina perched on the highest, thinnest branches, her body swaying with the rhythm of the dawn breeze. She was singing in a voice that did not seem to come from a human throat, a series of complex, melodic hymns that possessed a strange, vibrating quality. The language she used was entirely unknown to the scholars and priests, a collection of sounds that felt older than the stones of the church and more vast than the sea. The priest stood at the base of the tree, his ears straining to catch even a single recognizable word of Latin or Greek, but the hymns were as foreign to him as the songs of the angels. There was a mathematical precision to her singing, a layering of tones that suggested a deep, celestial order. To some of the listeners, the music brought a sense of unearthly peace, while to others, it was a source of profound agitation. They felt as though they were hearing the secrets of the universe being told in a tongue they were never meant to understand, a reminder of their own ignorance and the limitations of their earthly knowledge. From her high perch, Christina appeared completely indifferent to the crowd that had gathered below her. She looked like a creature made of light and wind, her skin glowing in the early morning sun, her movements fluid and bird-like. She would occasionally tilt her head as if listening to an answering voice from the clouds, her singing shifting in pitch and intensity to match an invisible choir. The physical impossibility of her position, resting her weight on branches that should have snapped under the weight of a small child, was a visual manifestation of the defiance that characterized her entire existence after the grave. The town of St. Truiden eventually stopped trying to capture her, as they realized that the iron of the earth could not hold the fire of the heavens. They accepted her as a permanent and haunting fixture of their landscape, a living ghost who moved between the trees and the tombs with a freedom that mocked their own stationary lives. The sight of her swaying in a storm or singing at dawn became a regular part of the town's rhythm, a constant and disturbing reminder that they were being watched by someone who had seen the end of time. The psychological toll on the inhabitants was immense, as they could never truly forget her presence. The tension between her apparent holiness and her undeniable madness created a split in the community that would never truly heal. Some began to secretly leave offerings of food at the base of the trees she favored, hoping to win her favor or at least avoid her judgment. Others stayed indoors whenever she was near, fearing that her gaze might reveal the hidden rot in their souls or bring a curse upon their households. The atmosphere of the town was forever changed, becoming a place where the thin veil between life and death was always visible, vibrating with the echoes of Christina's incomprehensible and haunting hymns. As she moved through the forest like a shadow, Christina became a legend while she was still breathing, a woman whose very existence was an argument against the permanence of the grave. She was the bride of the void, a soul that had tasted the sweetness of paradise and found the world of men to be a bitter and foul-smelling prison. Her isolation was not a choice made in anger, but a necessary condition of her new nature, a way to protect the purity she had gained in the fires of the afterlife. She remained a mystery that no chain could bind and no word could explain, a wild and holy terror. The image of the girl in the tree, her hair tangled with leaves and her voice rising in a celestial song, remained burned into the collective memory of everyone who saw her. She was a reminder that the world was much larger and more terrifying than the walls of their homes or the pages of their books. In her defiance of the earth, she offered a glimpse of a freedom that was as beautiful as it was frightening, a state of being where the laws of physics were replaced by the laws of grace. The town watched her from a distance, forever trapped between the desire to worship her and the urge to drive her away. By the end of this period, the people of St. Truiden had learned a hard and vital lesson about the nature of the miraculous. They realized that a miracle is not always a source of comfort, but can be a devastating force that shatters the comfortable illusions of daily life. Christina was a storm that had broken over their quiet town, a living sacrifice whose every movement was a testament to the agony of the divine. She remained on her high branches, singing her unknown hymns to a God who had sent her back to a world that could never truly contain her or understand the depth of her sacrifice. As the years began to layer themselves upon the history of St. Truiden like dust upon an ancient relic, the primitive terror that had once gripped the townspeople started to dissolve into a profound and heavy sense of awe. The woman who had been hunted with nets and bound with iron was no longer seen as a puppet of the adversary, but as a living bridge between the mundane and the divine. The very antics that had previously invited stones and mockery were now interpreted through the lens of a terrifying and sublime holiness. The town moved from a state of defensive panic to one of quiet, watchful reverence, realizing that they were in the presence of something that could not be judged by the flickering light of human reason alone. The change in perception was driven largely by a new and startling manifestation of her power that the local scholars began to call the gift of spiritual discernment. Christina was no longer just a figure of suffering, she became a mirror in which the souls of others were reflected with a brutal and undeniable clarity. She had developed the ability to look into the eyes of a passerby and see the hidden rot of a secret crime or the festering wound of an unconfessed malice. Her gaze was like a physical weight, a piercing beam of light that stripped away the elaborate masks worn by the rich and the poor alike, revealing the truth that lay beneath the surface of their carefully constructed lives. There were moments in the crowded marketplace when she would suddenly stop and fix her burning eyes upon a soldier or a merchant, her expression one of such intense sorrow that it bordered on physical pain. Under the pressure of her silent scrutiny, men who had spent their entire lives hardening their hearts would suddenly collapse onto the cobblestones in a fit of uncontrollable weeping. They would confess to sins long forgotten by everyone but God, their voices cracking as they sought the very absolution they had once mocked. It was as if her presence acted as a divine catalyst, forcing the darkness out of the shadows and into the cleansing light of public acknowledgement. This reputation for supernatural insight eventually reached the high stone towers of the local nobility, drawing those of great wealth and power into the orbit of the wild woman. The Countess of Laws, a woman accustomed to the finest silks and the most polished courtesies of the court, became obsessed with the spiritual authority that Christina seemed to carry in her very bones. She began to make frequent journeys into the wilderness, trading the comfort of her carriage for the muddy paths of the forest to seek the company of the one who lived among the branches. The contrast between the two women was a visual parable that the chroniclers of the age would never tire of describing to their readers. The Countess would often be found sitting at the base of a great tree, her expensive furs stained by the damp earth, while Christina perched far above her in the shadows of the leaves. There, in the silence of the woods, the noblewoman would offer up her most private fears and the heavy burdens of her station, looking upward as if she were speaking to an angel. Christina rarely spoke in return, but her presence was said to provide a comfort that no priest or advisor could offer. She became a spiritual mother to the powerful, a wild guide who led those lost in the complexities of the world back toward a simplicity that was as sharp and cold as a winter morning. The religious orders of the region, which had once been the loudest voices calling for her containment, now began to open their gates to her with a mixture of fear and trembling. The nuns of the monastery of St. Catherine grew accustomed to the sight of their strange guest appearing in their midst without the turning of a key or the opening of a heavy oak door. Christina had a way of bypassing the physical barriers of the world as if they were made of nothing more than mist and shadow. She would often be found standing in the center of a locked cell or kneeling in the high choir during the midnight hours, her body bathed in a light that did not come from any candle or lamp. The sisters of the convent began to treat these inexplicable appearances not as intrusions, but as holy visitations that blessed their communal life. They watched as she moved through their halls with the silence of a ghost, her feet never appearing to fully press upon the stone floors. Even the most rigorous of the sisters found themselves humbled by the intensity of her devotion, realizing that their own practiced asceticism was a mere shadow compared to the absolute surrender of Christina. She was a living testament to the possibility of a life lived entirely for the invisible, a soul that had already shed the heavy skin of the world while still walking within its restrictive and narrow confines. The abbots and the learned doctors of the church began to gather in their scriptoriums to debate the theological implications of her survival and her strange, enduring suffering. They moved away from the accusations of sorcery and began to frame her life as a unique and voluntary form of purgatory experienced on the earth. They argued that her frequent dives into the fire and her long vigils in the ice were not the actions of a madwoman, but a calculated and heroic act of vicarious atonement. She was, in their eyes, a human currency being spent to pay the debts of 1,000 other souls who were too weak or too blind to seek their own redemption from the flames. This new understanding allowed the community to view her agonizing lifestyle as a source of local pride and spiritual security. They began to believe that as long as Christina was suffering in their name, the town of St. Truden was protected from the wrath of heaven. The smoke from the ovens where she hid and the ice from the rivers where she stood became symbols of a divine contract, a sacrifice that kept the scales of justice in a state of delicate and miraculous balance. Her madness was rebranded as the highest form of sanity, a logical response to the terrifying reality of the afterlife that she had witnessed with her own resurrected and unblinking eyes. A strange peace began to settle over Christina as she found herself accepted by the very people she had previously found so repulsive. While she still claimed to detect the odor of sin, she began to notice that the scent was dampened in the presence of those who had truly repented. The bitter stench of malice and greed was replaced, in her perception, by a faint and sweet aroma that followed those who had been cleansed by their own tears of contrition. She no longer fled with the same desperation, but would sometimes allow the nuns to touch the hem of her tattered robe, her eyes softening as she recognized the spark of the divine within their mortal and fragile frames. She remained a creature of the heights, often choosing to spend her nights in the rafters of the convent chapel, but she began to participate in the spiritual life of the community in her own unconventional way. During the chanting of the psalms, her voice would sometimes join the choir from the darkness above, adding a high, crystalline harmony that made the stones of the building vibrate with a sympathetic resonance. The nuns would look up, their hearts swelling with a mixture of joy and terror, knowing that they were being accompanied by a voice that had heard the music of the spheres and the songs of the martyrs in the halls of the heavenly kingdom. As the years of her second life stretched into decades, the physical toll of her constant penances seemed to manifest in a way that was both beautiful and disturbing. Her hair had turned the color of mountain snow, and her skin was as thin and translucent as parchment, yet she moved with the agility of a young girl. There was an internal fire that seemed to support her frame, a vitality that ignored the usual decay of the aging process. She was a living paradox, a woman who looked like she was made of light and air, yet who carried the weight of the entire world's transgressions upon her narrow and unbowed shoulders. The fame of the woman who had returned from the dead drew kings and princes from distant lands, all seeking a glimpse of the one who had seen the fires of the abyss. They would arrive with their retinues of knights and servants, their bright banners fluttering in the wind, only to find themselves standing in the mud of a simple forest, looking up at a woman who cared nothing for their titles or their gold. Christina treated the highborn with the same piercing honesty she applied to the beggars, reminding them that in the halls of the afterlife, a crown was worth no more than a handful of dry and withered leaves. This period of her life was characterized by a strange and fragile integration into the fabric of medieval society, a time when the unacceptable became the foundation of the holy. She was the town's living saint, its wild conscience, and its most terrifying mystery all at once. The people of St. Truden had learned to live with the impossible, accepting the girl who lived on the wind as a necessary part of their spiritual ecosystem. They no longer sought to understand her, for they realized that she was a poem written by a divine hand, a message from the beyond that was meant to be felt rather than analyzed by the cold and limited mind. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, the Countess of Laws would sometimes look out from her castle windows toward the distant line of the trees, knowing that her mentor was there, watching over the souls of the living and the dead. The relationship between the noble and the mystic became a symbol of the age, a union of the earth and the sky that provided a sense of meaning to a world often defined by chaos and suffering. Christina had found a place where her suffering could be understood, a community that had finally learned to breathe the thin, cold air of the heights alongside her, if only for a brief and shimmering moment. The convent of St. Catherine became a site of constant pilgrimage, with the faithful hoping to catch a scent of the holiness that was said to radiate from the girl in the rafters. They brought their children to be blessed and their sick to be healed, and though Christina often remained hidden in the shadows, her presence was enough to instill a sense of profound hope. The air in the monastery was thick with the prayers of thousands, a rising tide of devotion that seemed to meet the downward descent of Christina's grace. It was a golden age for the town, a time when the veil between the worlds was at its thinnest and most permeable. Yet, even in this time of relative peace, there was an underlying tension that suggested this state of grace could not last forever. Christina was a visitor in the world of men, a guest who was overstaying her time in a house that was not her own. She was like a bird that had been caged for a season, its wings beating against the bars even when they were made of gold and lined with velvet. Her eyes were always fixed on the horizon, seeking the return of the silence she had left behind in the halls of the dead, her spirit longing for the final release from the burden of the flesh that she had carried so heroically. The theological records of the time grew thick with the accounts of her miracles and her insights, as if the church were trying to capture the lightning of her soul in the bottles of their ink and parchment. They recorded every movement and every sigh, trying to find a pattern in the chaos of her unconventional life. But Christina remained beyond their reach, a mystery that defied the categories of the scholastics and the rules of the saints. She was a law unto herself, a creature of the spirit who moved according to a logic that was as ancient as the stars and as fresh as the morning dew on the forest floor. As the chapter of her integration into the world reached its peak, she stood as the most famous woman in the lowlands, a figure of legend who was still breathing the common air of the fields. She had conquered the fear of the people and turned it into a weapon of salvation, using her own madness to heal the sanity of a broken world. She was the one who had been dead and was now more alive than the living, a paradox that continued to challenge and inspire everyone who crossed her path. The town of Sint-Truiden was her cathedral, and the hearts of the people were the altars where she laid her constant and agonizing sacrifices. The final days of this period were marked by a profound stillness, a sense that the work she had come back to do was nearing its completion. The souls she had seen in the fire had been prayed for, and the sins of the living had been mirrored and confessed. Christina spent more and more of her time in the quietest corners of the monastery, her singing growing softer and more melodic, as if she were preparing for a final conversation with the silence. The world watched her with bated breath, knowing that the woman who had already died once was preparing to cross the threshold for the second and final time, leaving them forever changed. 74 years had passed since the day the young woman first fell in the fields, and the long, agonizing journey of Christina the Astonishing finally seemed to draw toward its inevitable conclusion. In the quiet, stone-walled confines of the monastery of St. Catherine, the woman who had lived on the wind and among the dead lay upon a humble cot. Her physical form, which had endured the searing heat of ovens and the crushing weight of mill wheels, was now as thin and translucent as a piece of ancient parchment. The air in the small infirmary was thick with the scent of dried herbs and the low, rhythmic murmur of the sisters who had spent decades witnessing her impossible survival and her terrifyingly beautiful devotion to the suffering of others. The sisters moved with practiced silence, their soft leather shoes scuffing against the cold floor as they tended to the woman who had been their most mysterious guest. They watched the shallow rise and fall of her chest, marveling at how a frame so delicate could have housed a spirit of such fierce and unyielding intensity. Christina's eyes were closed, her face settled into a mask of deep contemplation that suggested she was already conversing with the entities of the realm she had visited so many years ago. There was no sign of the restlessness that had characterized her youth, only a profound and heavy stillness that filled the room like a tangible presence, signaling that the end of her second life was very near. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, amber shadows across the monastery gardens, Christina took one final, gentle breath and became still. The silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but a heavy, resonant weight that seemed to press against the very walls of the infirmary. The head sister reached out with a trembling hand to touch the cold skin of Christina's brow, confirming that the fire which had burned so brightly for over 7 decades had finally flickered out. There was no struggle, no cry of disgust at the stench of the world, only a peaceful surrender to the laws of nature that she had spent her entire adult life defying in the name of a higher calling. The news of her passing spread through the town of Sint-Truiden with the speed of a winter gale, carried by the somber tolling of the great bronze bells in the monastery tower. As the rhythmic chimes echoed across the thatched roofs and through the narrow cobblestone alleys, a strange and unexpected atmosphere began to settle over the inhabitants. It was not the crushing weight of grief that one might expect for a local saint, but rather a pervasive and undeniable sense of relief. For 40 years, the people had lived under the constant, piercing gaze of a woman who saw their every hidden sin, and her presence had been a demanding and exhausting mirror for their own moral failings and secret guilts. This relief manifested in the way neighbors looked at one another in the marketplace, their shoulders dropping as if a heavy physical burden had been lifted from their backs. The wild woman who could jump into fires and climb the highest trees was no longer a living judge stalking the periphery of their lives. Mothers no longer had to fear their children being struck by the sight of her agonizing penances, and the local merchants felt a sudden freedom from the silent accusations they had felt whenever she walked past their stalls. The town felt lighter, as if the spiritual atmosphere had been scrubbed clean of the intense, vibrating energy that Christina had brought back with her from the grave so long ago. Inside the monastery, however, the mood was one of profound and reverent preparation as the sisters began the ritual of washing and dressing the body for the final wake. They moved with a sense of sacred duty, their hands moving gently over the skin that had been scorched, frozen, and broken 1,000 times over. They expected to find a map of scars and ancient wounds, but instead, they found that her flesh was as smooth and unblemished as a river stone. It was as if her miraculous healing powers had worked one final, silent wonder before departing, leaving behind a vessel that showed no evidence of the horrific tortures she had inflicted upon herself for the sake of humanity's many sins. The body was carried into the monastery chapel and placed upon a raised bier, surrounded by tall beeswax candles that cast a soft, golden glow upon her serene features. The sisters gathered in the pews to begin the long night of the vigil, their voices rising in the traditional chants of the Office of the Dead. The air was filled with the sweet, cloying smell of incense and the flickering light of the flames, creating a sanctuary of peace that seemed to separate the chapel from the bustling world outside. They prayed for her soul to find the rest it had sought for so long, believing that she had finally been allowed to enter the gates she had turned away from in her youth. As the hours of the night dragged on toward the cold, gray light of dawn, the atmosphere in the chapel began to shift in a way that the sisters would later struggle to describe to the local authorities. A sudden, sharp chill swept through the stone arches, causing the candle flames to dance and sputter as if a great door had been flung open to the winter night. The chanting faltered and then stopped altogether as a heavy, electric silence filled the room, making the hair on the backs of the sisters' necks stand up in primal alarm. Every eye was drawn to the figure on the bier, which had remained perfectly motionless since the sun had set the evening before. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic sound, the sound of wood creaking under a sudden and deliberate weight. To the absolute horror and bewilderment of the gathered nuns, Christina's hand twitched, and her fingers curled around the edge of the embroidered shroud. With a suddenness that caused several sisters to cry out in terror, she sat bolt upright on the bier, her eyes snapping open to reveal a gaze that was sharper and more terrifying than anything they had seen during her long life. This was not the peaceful awakening of a saint, but the violent return of a spirit that had unfinished business with the world of the living. She did not look like a woman who had just returned from the bliss of paradise, but like a stern judge who had found her court in a state of unacceptable disorder. Her gaze swept over the gathered sisters with a cold and penetrating intensity, pinning each of them to their seats with the sheer force of her will. There was a vibrating energy in her frame that seemed to crackle through the very air of the chapel, making the stones hum with a low, resonant frequency. The sisters fell to their knees, some hiding their faces in their hands, while others watched in a state of paralyzed awe as the woman who had been dead for hours prepared to speak her final words. When she spoke, her voice did not carry the weakness of age or the frailty of a dying breath, but possessed a resonant, commandingly sharp tone that filled the vaulted ceiling like a clap of thunder. She did not offer a blessing or a vision of the heavens, but instead issued a final and devastating demand for absolute humility. She looked at the sisters, who had begun to take pride in their proximity to her holiness, and rebuked them for their secret arrogance and their desire for the fame that her presence brought to their order. Her words were a scalpel, cutting through the layers of their religious vanity and exposing the hollow core of their pride. She told them that the grace of the Creator was not a prize to be displayed or a tool for their own elevation, but a terrifying responsibility that demanded total self-effacement. Her eyes burned with an inner light as she warned them that the odor of their self-satisfaction was more offensive to the heavens than the sins of the common folk they looked down upon. The sisters wept, their hearts shattered by the directness of her accusation, realizing that even in her final moments, Christina was determined to be the catalyst for their painful and necessary purification. She stood as a sentinel of truth, refusing to let them settle into the comfort of a staged and easy holiness. Having delivered her final, stinging message, Christina looked upward one last time, her expression softening into a look of profound recognition and weary relief. The terrifying intensity in her eyes faded, replaced by a deep and quiet light that seemed to reflect the dawn breaking through the stained glass windows. She let out a long, slow sigh, a sound that carried the weight of 74 years of suffering and sacrifice, and then collapsed back onto the bier. The life departed from her body for the second and final time, leaving behind a silence that was even deeper and more absolute than the one that had preceded her sudden and shocking revival. This time, there was no doubt among the witnesses that the departure was permanent, for the air in the room felt suddenly empty and cold, as if the very soul of the building had been removed. The sisters remained on the floor for a long time, their bodies trembling with the aftershocks of what they had just witnessed, their minds struggling to reconcile the peaceful death they had expected with the violent and stern return they had experienced. They looked at the body of Christina, now once again a pale and silent statue, and felt a mixture of profound shame and even deeper reverence for the woman who had refused to die without one last act of correction. As the sun rose fully, bathing the chapel in a brilliant, golden light, the conviction began to take hold among the sisters and the townspeople that they had witnessed the ultimate confirmation of her sanctity. The news of the second resurrection spread even faster than the news of her first death, and the initial relief of the town was quickly replaced by a fervent and desperate religious ecstasy. They believed that if she had come back specifically to demand humility, it was because she was now an advocate of immense power in the celestial court. The idea that she had been granted the power to return twice was seen as a sign of divine favor that surpassed all other saints in the region. By midday, the first groups of pilgrims began to arrive at the monastery gates, their faces filled with a mixture of desperate hope and fearful curiosity. They came from the neighboring villages and eventually from the distant cities of the lowlands, drawn by the stories of the woman who could not be contained by the grave. They brought their sick on stretchers, their blind children held by the hand, and their crippled elders riding on the backs of mules. The town of Sint-Truiden was transformed within hours from a quiet provincial center into a bustling hub of spiritual activity, its streets once again filled with the scent of the living and the noise of the hopeful. The monastery authorities, despite the stinging rebuke they had received from the resurrected Christina, moved quickly to organize the influx of the faithful. They understood that the body on the bier was no longer just a departed sister, but a holy relic of unimaginable value that would define the future of their order for centuries to come. They began to plan for a grand tomb and a permanent shrine where the pilgrims could offer their prayers and seek the intercessions of the astonishing. The air of the monastery was soon thick with the sounds of construction and the chanting of endless masses, a factory of devotion that operated around the clock. Everyone who stood in the long lines waiting to enter the chapel was convinced that a single touch of the shroud or a moment spent in the presence of her remains would result in a miraculous healing. They spoke in hushed tones of the fire that did not burn her and the water that did not drown her, seeing her life as a guarantee that their own sufferings could be overcome through her grace. The atmosphere was one of profound expectation, a collective belief that the world was about to be tilted on its axis by the power of the woman who had bridged the gap between life and death not once, but twice. The sisters watched the crowds from their high windows, the words of Christina's final rebuke still ringing in their ears like a constant and painful alarm. They saw the coins being dropped into the collection boxes and the fame of their abbey growing with every passing hour, and they felt the heavy weight of the humility she had demanded of them. They were caught between the public celebration of a saint and the private realization that they had been judged and found wanting by the very woman they were now promoting to the world. It was a time of great external glory and internal crisis, a paradox that would have pleased Christina in its complexity. As the chapter of her physical presence on earth finally closed, the legend of Christina the Astonishing began its long and enduring life in the minds of the people. She had become a symbol of the impossible, a reminder that the spirit is a wild and uncontrollable force that cannot be bound by the expectations of the church or the logic of the world. The town waited for the first documented miracle, the first blind man to see or the first lame girl to walk, certain that the woman who had suffered so much would now provide the comfort she had so often denied herself. The stage was set for the final revelation of her legacy, a climax that no one in the town of Sint-Truiden was truly prepared to face. The golden light of late afternoon filtered through the narrow slits of the monastery's high windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced like tiny spirits above the cold stone floor. Outside, the clamor of thousands of pilgrims had reached a fever pitch, their voices a low, incessant drone that sounded like a distant, angry sea. They were waiting for the holy remains to be brought forth, for the final chance to touch the hem of a saint's shroud and be healed of their earthly miseries. Inside the inner sanctum, a heavy, suffocating silence reigned, broken only by the soft, rhythmic splashing of water in a silver basin as the chosen sisters prepared for the final ritual of the washing. 3 elderly nuns, who had spent their entire lives within these gray walls, stood over the wooden bier where the body of Christina lay in the flickering light of a dozen tall candles. They moved with a practiced, reverent slowness, their hearts filled with a mixture of profound sorrow and a quiet, hidden pride. They expected this moment to be the crowning glory of their order, the final proof that the woman who had lived among them was indeed a celestial being temporarily trapped in a mortal frame. Their hands trembled slightly as they reached for the edges of the coarse linen shroud, anticipating the sight of a body that had been transformed by decades of holy suffering into a relic. As the heavy fabric was pulled back, the sisters let out a collective gasp of utter bewilderment, for the sight that met their eyes defied every expectation of their long years of service. They had anticipated seeing a withered, skeletal form covered in the white lines of scars from the fires and the jagged marks of the mill wheels that had crushed her bones. Instead, the flesh of Christina, who had reached the age of 74, appeared as smooth and supple as that of a young girl in the prime of her youth. There was not a single blemish, not a single wrinkle or mark of the impossible tortures she had sought out so relentlessly throughout her long and harrowing second life. Her skin possessed a strange, translucent quality, glowing with a faint, internal radiance that seemed to push back the encroaching shadows of the evening. To the observers, it looked as though her body had been cast in fine alabaster or carved from the freshest winter snow, preserved by a divine hand against the natural processes of decay and the ravages of time. It was a visual miracle that seemed to confirm her absolute purity, a physical manifestation of a soul that had successfully burned away every earthly imperfection in the furnaces of her own voluntary agony. They felt as though they were looking upon a creature that had never known the heavy, dragging weight of human sin. The sisters exchanged glances of ecstatic joy, convinced that they were about to witness the final, traditional sign of sanctity, the manifestation of the odor of roses or lilies. It was well known in the hallowed halls of the church that the bodies of the truly holy did not emit the foulness of the grave, but rather a perfume so sweet and celestial that it could heal the spirits of all who inhaled it. They leaned in closer, their nostrils twitching in anticipation of a scent that would be more intoxicating than the finest incense ever burned in the great cathedrals of the East. They prepared their sponges and oils, eager to touch the skin that felt as fresh as a morning rose. However, the moment the head nun's fingers made contact with the cold, radiant surface of Christina's shoulder, the atmosphere in the room underwent a sudden and violent transformation. It was as if a seal had been broken on a forgotten and ancient well of corruption, allowing a wave of darkness to flood the sacred space. The light from the candles seemed to dim and flicker as a heavy, invisible pressure descended upon the witnesses, making it difficult for them to draw a full breath. The initial sensation of peace was shattered instantly, replaced by a primal, gut-wrenching alarm that vibrated in the very marrow of their bones, though they did not yet understand the source of their terror. A scent began to rise from the unblemished body, but it was not the promised perfume of the heavens that the sisters had so fervently prayed for during their long vigil. It was a smell so heavy, so cloying, and so utterly unendurable that it seemed to possess a physical weight, coating the back of their throats with a bitter, metallic taste. It was the stench of profound and ancient decay, a concentrated essence of rot that surpassed any physical decomposition ever encountered in the most plague-ridden corners of the world. It was a smell that carried the memory of 1,000 stagnant marshes and the putrid remains of 1,000,000 forgotten and festering corpses left to rot in the sun. The nuns recoiled as if they had been struck by a physical blow, their faces contorting in expressions of visceral, uncontrollable disgust and horror. One of the sisters fell to her knees, her body racked by violent heaving as her stomach revolted against the miasma that now filled the vaulted room from floor to ceiling. They clutched their veils to their faces in a desperate attempt to filter the air, but the odor was pervasive, seemingly entering through their very pores. It was a smell that did not just offend the senses, but attacked the mind, bringing with it a flood of dark, intrusive images of hidden vices, secret cruelties, and the silent screams of the unrepentant. They realized with a terrifying clarity that this was not the smell of biological death, but the exact same spiritual stench that Christina had screamed about when she first rose from her coffin. All those years ago, she had fled into the high rafters of the church to escape the smell of human sin, and now, it appeared that the source of that very same foulness was her own silent and pristine body. The air in the sanctum became so thick with the odor of spiritual rot that the oil in the lamps seemed to curdle, and the silver vessels on the altar began to take on a dull, gray tarnish as if they were being corroded by the sheer intensity of the atmospheric filth. The terrifying truth began to dawn on the priest who had entered to oversee the final anointing, his face turning the color of ash as he realized the nature of what they were witnessing. Christina had not been a filter that purified the world, but a vessel that had spent 7 decades absorbing the darkness of every soul she encountered. She had been a living sponge for the global archive of human depravity, taking into her own flesh the spiritual pus of the greedy, the lustful, and the murderous. Every act of penance she had performed in the fires and the ice had not been to destroy the sin, but to make room within her own spirit to contain even more of the world's inexhaustible supply of filth. She had become a living tomb for the collective shadow of humanity, a repository for the very same stench she had found so unendurable during her life on the earth. The smooth, fresh skin they had marveled at was nothing more than a thin, deceptive membrane stretched tight over a churning ocean of spiritual corruption. Underneath that radiant alabaster surface lay the concentrated weight of 1,000 years of human wickedness, a non-decaying noise that would never be cleansed and could never be released. They were not looking at a saint who had transcended the world, but at a creature that had been drowned by it, becoming a permanent monument to its eternal and unredeemable foulness. The sisters looked at the body and felt a wave of anger and betrayal that was even more powerful than their initial sense of physical revulsion. They had spent their lives following a woman they believed was leading them toward the light, only to discover that she was a carrier of the very darkness they sought to escape. The miracles they had recorded, the visions they had cherished, and the suffering they had idolized now seemed like the elaborate decoys of a cruel and mocking cosmic force. They felt as though they had been tricked into worshipping a vessel of spiritual sewage, mistaking the shine of a poisoned surface for the brilliance of a divine and holy light. In a state of panicked desperation, the priest ordered the sisters to cover the body immediately and to fetch the heaviest oak lid for the coffin before the stench could spread further. They moved with a frantic, trembling energy, their previous reverence replaced by a cold and jagged fear that bordered on absolute madness. They did not want to touch the body again, fearing that the corruption might leap from her skin to theirs like a contagious and incurable plague. They threw the shroud over her with a violent, shoving motion and slammed the lid down, the sound of the wood meeting wood echoing through the chapel like a final, definitive sentence of abandonment. Even through the thick oak and the iron bands, the smell seemed to seep out, lingering in the cracks of the stone floor and clinging to the tapestries on the walls. The monastery, which was supposed to be a beacon of hope for the thousands of people waiting outside, had instead become a prison for the concentrated essence of the world's most hidden and terrible crimes. The priest looked at the closed coffin and felt a chilling certainty that the body inside would never rot, but would remain forever in that state of fresh, radiant corruption, a silent and eternal witness to the futility of their attempts at spiritual purification. The official ceremony that followed was a hollow and terrifying mockery of a saint's burial, performed in total silence by men and women whose eyes were wide with a new and unbearable knowledge. They did not allow the pilgrims to touch the coffin, nor did they permit them to see the face of the woman who had been their astonishing icon for so long. The crowds outside were told that the holiness of the remains was too great for the eyes of the common folk, a lie that tasted like ash in the mouths of the priests who uttered it. They hurried the procession toward the crypt, their feet moving in a desperate rhythm to be rid of the burden they carried. When the heavy stone slab was finally slid into place over the tomb, the silence that fell over the crypt was not one of peace, but of a profound and lingering dread. The sisters and the priests retreated into the upper levels of the monastery, their hearts cold and their faith shattered by the revelation of the noise that lay beneath the surface of their devotions. They knew that the secret of Christina would remain buried with her, a hidden rot at the foundation of their order that would slowly poison their prayers and their peace for generations to come. The town of St. Truiden would continue to celebrate its saint, but those who had seen the truth would never truly sleep again. The legacy of Christina the Astonishing was finally revealed not as a bridge to heaven, but as a mirror of the abyss that humans carry within themselves. She had completed her mission, but it was a mission of accumulation rather than one of release, a terrifying act of storage that had left her as a monument to the permanence of evil. As the pilgrims finally dispersed into the night, their hearts filled with a false and manufactured hope, the monastery stood as a dark and silent sentinel over the tomb of the woman who had become exactly what she hated most. The world remained as foul as it had always been, and its newest saint was now its most concentrated and unendurable source of spiritual filth.